Hi class, here we are at the final lecture of the semester, so that's exciting. Um, just thought we'd close the semester out by just talking about ethics and some applied issues and transferring that into being a responsible citizen. The Reagan article is going to kind of talk about, well, regardless of the actual topic, it's talking about the kind of things that we as individuals need to be thinking about in terms of responsible citizens. Whereas the Shue is going to talk more about policy at a global level, although really both have ties to each other. So the Reagan stuff very easily transfers to policy and vice versa. Um, for instance, both talk about pollution importantly, and um, both should entail that we're doing our part to be sure we're being responsible to other citizens. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. So uh, let's start with the Reagan. It's largely an introductory piece. You don't get a whole lot of new facts and argument out of it. Instead, it just gets you thinking about a lot of the kind of things you take for granted that maybe you haven't thought through all the moral implications and issues of. So, just starts with food. In the US, we have very cheap food, but we get that very cheap food through factory farming. And as a result, um, there's some very important implications. One, of course, is pesticide. It ends up in the runoff from the food, um, goes into the aquifer. People 200 years from now might be suffering and getting cancer from our not being responsible raising food right now. Also talked about acid rain. There's a couple of various sources for that, of course. Uh, Ohio coal was kind of number one when this article was written. Coal's a little better now, and acid rain is a little less of an issue in terms of the environment, but it's still a problem. Acid rain leads to what they call dead lakes, where it's just there's too high of an acidity for life to live in, and that's a problem. And so, kind of bringing this all together with the pollution and stuff, I'd like to just read a little quote from page 864. So, food for thought, pardon the pun. The food on our plate that we eat today, does it include a message from future persons condemning us for a failure of moral will and vision to act now to protect the vital interests of generations to come? Uh, this goes into pollution. The bigger pollution's a huge problem right now. More generally, leads to a lot of issues with chemicals, but the biggest one right now, of course, is climate change. Um, we're assuming we're not the last generation, although with climate change we might be the last several generations. But we really need to be thinking about what duties and responsibilities we have to the next generation. I personally try to make one little change every month to try to do a little better with the environment. And I'll be honest, to kind of motivate myself to do that, having a kid, someday I'm going to have to look my daughter in the eye and say and tell her about, well, why did we waste all the resources? Why did we not bother to do much or anywhere near enough about climate change, etc.? That's going to be a hard talk. One of my colleagues has called climate change our Nazi moment because everyone knows it's going on. Everybody knows it's a global catastrophe, possibly a global killer. And we're just kind of assuming somebody else will do something about it. And those are going to be some hard questions to answer a little later on. And they deserve some speculation now and some changes in our behavior. Um, Another thing he talks about technically relating to the food is farm animals, very chemical heavy as well, doing bad things to our body, but also incredibly wasteful. So if he gave an example of the protein waste, we have to feed cows basically 7 times the protein we get out of them, and so it's inefficient and wasteful. And again, that goes to future generations. Of course, factory farms are also just ecological time bombs, especially pig factories. We already talked about a little. But we might also think about the distribution of resources. Well, I'm effectively throwing 7 plates of dinner away every time I have a plate of steak because, again, the protein exchange. And so here's another question. Do we owe it to the starving to waste less food? And do we owe it to the next generation to waste less energy turning it into food? Um, Etc. But we might also think about, do we owe it to animals? Um, if causing pain is a bad thing, and just about everybody seems to think that's relevant to ethics, well, what about these animals we're causing pain to? Uh, or what about habitats? He also talked about, do we have duties to wild animals? Factory farms and our other developments are taking away important habitats. Um, this all kind of assumes that we're the only species that matter, a very anthropocentric view, but we do value things this way, but should we? And so those are all just very interesting and important ethical issues that we get just without even leaving our the room we're sitting in. Assuming you have a plate in there. We don't even need to look farther than what's in front of us to realize there's very important moral issues that require our attention, our care, and our clear and critical thinking. So let's take some of the lessons from this course and get to work. So that's why I like the Reagan article as one of the kind of last piece for the semester. Moving to the Shue is a little harder article, but it's straightforward in some senses. So just background. Basically, the developed countries developed by destroying the environment. And now that we are developed, we don't want other countries to do the same thing, contributing to a catastrophe that we've already put in motion in terms of climate change. So the rich states ignored the environment, but we don't want the poor states to follow suit. That will be bad for us. And so with that, we might start asking who's responsible and how they shall be responsible. And Shue's going to argue that there's three distinct principles that imply that, in fact, the first world countries, the developed countries, the rich countries who have profited by all this should really be responsible for the costs of climate change in a way that implies a certain type of egalitarian relationship with other countries. He's quick to clarify he's not a complete egalitarian, but certainly equal dignity and respect. But anyway, we're just going to go through these 3 principles and maybe talk and then leave it to you to think about. The one he starts with is in economics. It's called the internalization of externalities. That the cost of cleanup is put in the price of a product. So if we make a mess, then we put it in the product to sell it. And you say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, who's the one who made the mess? Me. If I build that into the price of the product, then I'm actually passing the price on to someone else who isn't responsible for it. And hence, it's an expansive inequality. Well, if I'm selling my products to the lesser developed countries, I'm basically making them pay additionally for that. And so that's the general problem, which leads to his first, what he calls the principle of equity. So when a party has, this is on 870. When a party has in the past taken an unfair advantage of others by imposing costs upon them without their consent, those who have been unilaterally put at a disadvantage are entitled to demand that in the future the offending party shoulders burdens that are unequal, at least to the extent of the unfair advantage previously taken, in order to restore equality. And so that's the general, that's the more precise version of, well, why, for equity, the people who have gained need to accept that burden rather than the people who and they accept it from the people they've been harming or passing the cost to in that way. So again, think in terms of global warming and climate change. That um, well, we the developed by we I mean the developed world have been the primary purveyors and causers of harm for that, um, and that is of course harmed others, and it is and it is very much against equity that if we force them to pay for it. And this principle, he says, this should be much stronger than the one that's kind of in vogue nowadays called the polluter pays principle, because the polluter pays principle is only forward-looking. It only makes me pay for future pollution, but in fact, I've already gotten rich from past pollution. And so it's at this point he's kind of transitions into, well, there's three arguments against the first principle of equity, and he says they all fail. So um, the first one kind of hinted at already is, sorry, no, I'm not going in order. The first one is the fact that, well, wait a minute, the less developed countries have benefited from all the industrialization we've done. They could buy their products cheaper, da 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 da. And you say, yes, but they've already paid for that benefit. We didn't give them the stuff for free. They have paid us money for those benefits, and so that's not going to work. You can't double charge them, basically. The second kind of argument is, well, we didn't know about catastrophic climate change until late 80s. Yeah, for you younger generation, that's when we knew about it and we had to do something about it. And then we kind of sat and twiddled our thumbs and said, short-term gain's nice. But anyway, that's an aside. But the important point that Shue raises is we're not punishing. Yes, of course you can't punish somebody for a crime that they basically didn't know they were committing, although technically you can. But you can't hold them responsible. So if they didn't know at the time they ran over your dog, well, you can still hold them responsible for running over the dog, but maybe not punish them. Just ask them to make it right. And then lastly, you might say, well, wait a minute. If we're talking about the previous generations that didn't know and all this stuff, it was older people. It wasn't me doing all this harm. Why should I have to pay? Well, there's two responses for that. One, again, we knew about the catastrophic effects of global warming for the last 30 years, and we pretty much sat there and not did anything. So it's still ongoing. It's not like we've stopped global warming as soon as we figured out about it. But second of all, and more importantly, morally speaking, even if it was my parents' generation who did it, not me, I still gained from it. I still inherited all of the wealth that, abusing resources irresponsibly created. I line my pockets with it, and so there's a very important sense in which I am responsible. Again, maybe not punishable, but responsible in the sense that some of my wealth is ill-gained, and I really should be sharing it. So none of those three work against the initial principle of equity. The second principle of equity is an interesting one. There's another reason that the developed countries should be able to pay, and that's because we have a better ability to. So among a number of parties, all of whom are bound to contribute to some common endeavor, the parties who have the most resources normally should contribute the most to the endeavor. And he takes some time explaining this one. But first of all, you might initially think that if we're talking about a percentage, well, if everybody kicks in 5% of their income or salary, what have you, that's equal. Well, there's a very important sense in which it is not. And this is something that we actually know as a country, believe it or not, because that's not how our taxes are set up. So people have proposed flat taxes, and it's not beneficial to the poor or even the lower, and middle classes, because um, taxes don't just go into income. Taxes go into um, disposable income. So if somebody increases my taxes by 5%, that could wipe out all of my disposable income, whereas 5% might not even make a dent in the top 1%'s income. So that's why taxes have a graduated scale, and that's what Shue's talking about as well. Well, we can't just do a flat tax. We have to do some sort of graduated scale, which means the people with the extremely high wealth and the most most expendable ability, expending ability. Sorry, thank you. That's what I was trying to go for. Uh, the people who have this disposable income and can lose quite a bit without it going, sorry, not people, countries, that is the most equitable, because you should really think of it in terms of the equity involved isn't a flat rate, it isn't a flat percentage, it's flat units or flat percentage. It's you think in terms of how easy it is to give. So if we wanted to have super equity, everybody gives what's easiest to give. That's how you stay equal in terms of kind of comfort and discomfort. um, so that's the second principle. Third principle has to do with this guaranteed minimum and the radical inequality. So radical inequality exists. Let me just read it through here. Um, when the aggregate total of resources is sufficient for all parties um, to have more than enough, some parties do in fact have more than enough, some much more than enough, and then lastly, other parties have less than enough. So that's radical inequality. Because why is it radical? Because some people are unable to make even the minimum baseline, whatever, and yet others are well above it. So, let's take to just give a kind of exaggerated example. Imagine there are 10 people in a room starving to death, and then one person sitting there with more food than they could ever eat in their lifetime. That's radical inequality. And it's not as simplified as you think, because, 10,000 people a day, I believe it is, die from starvation-related stuff. That was sort of the old number anyway, was in the Reagan. Um, but anyway, that's the general, we have this radical inequality here. And when that happens, we lead to the third principle of equity, which states when some people have less than enough for a decent human life, and he's very tight with that. So a little bit more than mere physical survival against the essentials, clothing, protection against the elements, but also clothing adequate in appearance to avoid embarrassment by local standards. That's the kind of bare minimum we're talking about here. So when some people have less than enough for a decent human life, other people have far more than enough, and the total resources available are so great that everyone could have at least enough without preventing some people from still retaining considerably more than others have. It is unfair not to guarantee everyone at least adequate minimum. So it's kind of the thought of, well, gee, if I gave everybody enough to make minimum wage, then I'd only be a billionaire instead of a multi-billionaire. Like, That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. And so that's the third principle of equality. If we endorse that, as kind of already hinted at, the main beneficiaries are children, because children have these extreme poverty problems. And so, and that's important because, again, going back to Singer a few units ago, it's not that children did anything to deserve their lot either. So, he does address the, he says the overpopulation objection is outrageous. Yes, it absolutely is. So first of all, you don't fix overpopulation by letting people. So he doesn't act. He says it's so bad that he doesn't even address it. But I'll address it. One, you don't address overpopulation by letting people starve to death. That's not the way you address overpopulation. But second of all, even if you did decide the solution to overpopulation is getting rid of some people, well, why think the system of letting the poor people die is the fair one? Maybe we should have the least moral people go away, or some other criterion. So that conclusion wouldn't even follow if we were to accept that monstrous conclusion is what we do with overpopulation. And of course, there's kind of the material argument. Again, we mentioned this in the Singer sum that, well, if you give everybody the minimum, and we see this kind of nowadays. We've seen a few political candidates making the argument for basically a minimum standard of living. That actually pays for itself in important senses because you drastically reduce crime and things like that, and decrease cost of health care, blah, 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 blah. So there's also kind of this materialistic argument that if you're really selfish, well, make sure you're not creating a bunch of criminals and chaos and regimes and unstable trading partners and things like that. So, again, he took that argument as so offensively bad he didn't address it, but in case you're wondering the reasons, uh, that's the other thing to mention. So, but then also in favor of this third principle of equity, think of what it would mean to say otherwise. And again, I'm going to quote him here on 876. It's to say, if the wealthy states say to the poor states, in effect, our most urgent request of you is that you act in a way that will avoid worsening the ozone depletion and global warming that we have started, the poor states could reasonably respond, our most urgent request of you is assistance in guaranteeing the fulfillment of the essential needs of our citizens. In other words, if the wealthy have no general obligation to help the poor certainly have no general obligation to help the wealthy. And we've seen this idea a little bit tossed around in the 2020 presidential election. Biden pointed out that the Amazon rainforest alone absorbs all the carbon footprint of the U.S., or I should say the amount of. And so if we actually just pass them some financial aid and say, we're happy to, in essence, pay for you to not destroy the resources that are helping everybody, those are solutions that can work. So let me pause here. That's the Shue article. Now, again, big picture, he's simply claiming that those who have already benefited from by contributing to climate disaster and other types of pollution, etc., be the ones who should pay for it, in the very literal sense of paying for it. And he's given 3 arguments for that about why that is equitable, why that is fair, even though it seems to create kind of this wealth inequality. Well, why should we have to pay for the whole world kind of idea? And so, but again, like the Reagan article, you should really kind of transfer this, not just in terms of policy, probably you should cast your vote towards responsible leaders who are thinking in the right kind of ways morally, But also, you could really kind of internalize a lot of these principles. Um, you could waste less. You could try to contribute less to the problem. You can vocally support solutions that are equitable and things like that as well. Overall, and this is where I really want to emphasize, our last discussion board for the semester on these, um, talk about what you can be and should be doing as a morally responsible person. Talk about some changes you think we should implement. Ideally, this next step is then to actually do them. But just you as a student, you as a person sitting there listening to this course, uh, what can you do and what should you do? And use the Reagan and Shue as a springboard to lead into that to engage. I hope you enjoyed the semester, and we will see you with the final review.